The vast majority of criminal cases are resolved through a plea. This is when an agreement is reached by the defendant and the prosecution on what should be done with the defendant. Sometimes the plea is unagreed, and the prosecutor wants one thing for a plea deal and the defendant wants another. In that case, you go before the judge, and both sides will make their case for their recommendation. Now, when this happens, when the parties are unagreed, usually the biggest issue is whether the defendant should plead guilty or whether the defendant should receive what's called a CWOF, which is a continuation without a finding. So what happens is the defendant will acknowledge facts sufficient for a finding of guilty, but will not actually plead guilty. And that guilty will be continued without a finding, and the case will be dropped if the defendant fulfills whatever obligations he or she has for probation. Now, this becomes especially important when the defendant has no criminal record, because a CWOF it is not a conviction, it's not a guilty, and you keep your record pretty much intact. You're not a felon, you're not a criminal, and it's what most people want when they're a defendant. The prosecutor will almost always ask for a guilty. Now, if you have a number of convictions or guilties on your record, it becomes very hard to ask the court for a CWOF at that point. So it very much depends on your record. It depends on the nature of the case, how strong the facts are against you, the severity of the offense. But in most cases, if you're going to tender a plea, you want to ask for a continuation without a finding rather than a guilty verdict.